Question 1. Implementation of a wastewater discharge audit at a manufacturing facility reveals that the effluent's pH levels have consistently exceeded the permitted upper limit by a small margin for the past 3 monitoring periods. While no immediate, visible signs of aquatic life distress have been reported in the receiving water body, the facility management states they are investigating the cause and expect to resolve it within the next quarter. As the certified professional environmental auditor, what is the most appropriate course of action under the U.S. Clean Water Act framework? Option A. Accept the facility's verbal assurances of investigation and planned resolution, and document the deviation as a minor issue with no immediate need for further action or reporting. Option B. Advise the facility to continue monitoring the situation and to provide a report on the cause and resolution only if a significant adverse environmental impact becomes evident. Option C. Recommend that the facility focus on other, more critical environmental compliance areas and revisit the pH exceedance only if it becomes a recurring problem over a longer period. Option D. Recommend the facility immediately implement documented corrective actions to bring the pH within permit limits and formally notify the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, of the exceedance and the corrective measures being taken. The correct answer is D. Recommend the facility immediately implement documented corrective actions to bring the pH within permit limits and formally notify the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, of the exceedance and the corrective measures being taken. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge for environmental auditors, balancing regulatory compliance with operational realities and potential economic impacts. The auditor must determine the appropriate course of action when a facility's wastewater discharge, while not immediately posing a catastrophic environmental threat, deviates from its permit limits. This requires a deep understanding of the Clean Water Act (CPEA) and its implementing regulations, specifically the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System (NPDES) program. The auditor's judgment is critical in assessing the severity of the noncompliance, the potential for future harm, and the facility's commitment to corrective action. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes immediate, verifiable corrective actions and transparent communication with the regulatory agency. This aligns with the CPEA's objective of restoring and maintaining the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. By requiring the facility to implement immediate corrective measures and notify the EPA, the auditor ensures that potential environmental harm is minimized and that regulatory oversight is maintained. This proactive stance is ethically sound and legally defensible under the CPEA. An incorrect approach that involves delaying action until a more significant environmental impact is observed is ethically and regulatorily flawed. The CPEA is a preventative statute. It aims to stop pollution before it causes substantial damage. Waiting for a significant impact would violate the spirit and letter of the law, potentially leading to penalties and environmental degradation. Another incorrect approach, which is to solely rely on the facility's verbal assurances without documented corrective actions, fails to establish a verifiable record of compliance. The CPEA requires demonstrable adherence to permit conditions. Verbal assurances are insufficient evidence of compliance and leave the facility vulnerable to future enforcement actions. This approach also undermines the auditor's professional responsibility to provide objective assurance. A third incorrect approach, which is to ignore the deviation because it is not causing immediate, visible harm, demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of environmental auditing and the CPEA. Environmental regulations often address potential or chronic impacts, not just acute ones. Ignoring minor deviations can lead to cumulative environmental damage and a culture of noncompliance. The professional decision-making process for similar situations involves a systematic evaluation. 1. Identify the specific regulatory requirement, e.g., NPDES permit limit. 2. Assess the nature and extent of the deviation from the requirement. 3. Evaluate the potential environmental and human health risks associated with the deviation. 4. Determine the immediate and long-term corrective actions necessary to achieve compliance. 5. Document all findings, assessments, and recommended actions. 6. Communicate findings and recommendations to the facility management and, if necessary, the regulatory authority in accordance with professional standards and regulatory requirements. Question 2. Operational review demonstrates that a manufacturing facility is meeting all current regulatory compliance requirements. However, there are increasing community concerns regarding potential long-term impacts of historical waste disposal practices and growing employee interest in the company's sustainability initiatives. As the Certified Professional Environmental Auditor, CP, which approach best aligns with professional best practices for this audit? Option A. Concentrate the audit solely on the financial implications of environmental compliance, assessing cost-effectiveness of current practices and recommending cost-saving measures that do not involve significant changes to operational procedures or environmental controls. Option B. Focus the audit scope on verifying continued compliance with current regulations and documenting management's stated commitment to sustainability, without direct engagement with external stakeholders or employees on their specific concerns. Option C. Conduct a detailed historical analysis of all waste disposal records to identify any past noncompliance, even if currently resolved, and report these findings without considering current operational performance or stakeholder perspectives. Option D. Prioritize identifying and engaging with key stakeholders, including community representatives and employee groups, to understand their environmental concerns and expectations, and integrate these insights into the audit scope and criteria, alongside regulatory requirements and management objectives. The correct answer is B. Focus the audit scope on verifying continued compliance with current regulations and documenting management's stated commitment to sustainability, without direct engagement with external stakeholders or employees on their specific concerns. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental auditors, balancing the immediate operational needs of a facility with long-term environmental compliance and stakeholder expectations. The auditor must consider the diverse interests of various stakeholders, including regulatory bodies, local communities, employees, and the company's management and shareholders. A purely compliance-driven approach might overlook opportunities for proactive environmental stewardship, while an overly stakeholder-centric approach without a strong foundation in regulatory requirements could lead to non-compliance. The professionally challenging aspect lies in integrating these perspectives into a cohesive and actionable audit strategy that addresses both current risks and future sustainability. The correct approach, focusing on identifying and engaging key stakeholders to understand their concerns and expectations regarding environmental performance, represents best professional practice because it aligns with the principles of responsible environmental management and auditing. This proactive engagement allows the auditor to tailor the audit scope and objectives to address material environmental issues that are significant to both the business and its stakeholders. It fosters transparency, builds trust, and ensures that the audit findings are relevant and actionable, leading to improved environmental performance beyond mere regulatory adherence. This aligns with the ethical imperative for auditors to conduct their work with integrity and due diligence, considering the broader impact of environmental performance. An approach that solely prioritizes immediate cost savings without considering the environmental implications or stakeholder concerns fails to meet the ethical and professional standards of an environmental auditor. This could lead to regulatory violations, reputational damage, and long-term environmental liabilities, demonstrating a failure to exercise due professional care and a disregard for the principles of environmental stewardship. Another incorrect approach, focusing exclusively on historical compliance data without seeking forward-looking stakeholder input or considering emerging environmental risks, is also professionally deficient. While historical data is crucial, it does not capture evolving stakeholder expectations or potential future environmental challenges. This narrow focus can result in an audit that is technically correct but lacks strategic relevance and fails to drive meaningful improvement in environmental performance. It neglects the broader context of environmental management and the auditor's role in promoting sustainable practices. Finally, an approach that solely relies on management's self-reported environmental performance without independent verification or stakeholder consultation is fundamentally flawed. This bypasses the auditor's core responsibility of providing an objective and independent assessment. It risks overlooking systemic issues and can lead to a misrepresentation of the facility's true environmental status, undermining the credibility of the audit and potentially exposing the organization to significant risks. The professional decision-making process for similar situations involves a systematic evaluation of the audit objectives, the regulatory landscape, and the identified stakeholders. The auditor should first establish a clear understanding of the applicable environmental regulations and standards. Subsequently, they should identify all relevant stakeholders and assess their potential interests and concerns related to the facility's environmental performance. This information should then be used to define the audit scope, select appropriate audit criteria, and develop a plan that balances regulatory compliance with stakeholder expectations and proactive environmental management. Regular communication and feedback loops with stakeholders throughout the audit process are essential for ensuring relevance and buy-in. Question 3. The performance metrics show a significant reduction in waste generation over the past year, but anecdotal evidence from site personnel suggests increased reliance on off-site waste disposal services and a lack of internal waste segregation practices. As a certified professional environmental auditor, which audit type and methodology would be most appropriate to gain a comprehensive understanding of the organization's waste management performance and compliance? Option A. A focused audit solely on verifying the accuracy of the reported waste generation metrics against disposal invoices. Option B. A comprehensive environmental management system, EMS, audit, incorporating a review of waste management policies and procedures, interviews with relevant personnel, and on-site verification of waste handling and disposal practices. Option C. A compliance audit limited to checking permits for off-site waste disposal facilities. Option D. An audit relying exclusively on the environmental consultant's previous reports on waste management. The correct answer is B. A comprehensive environmental management system, EMS, audit, incorporating a review of waste management policies and procedures, interviews with relevant personnel, and on-site verification of waste handling and disposal practices. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the auditor to discern the most appropriate audit type and methodology when faced with potentially misleading or incomplete performance data. The auditor must move beyond surface-level metrics to understand the underlying environmental management system, EMS, effectiveness and compliance status. Careful judgment is required to select an approach that will provide assurance on compliance and identify areas for improvement, rather than simply validating reported numbers. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the principles of a comprehensive environmental audit as defined by relevant professional standards and regulatory expectations for the Certified Professional Environmental Auditor (CPEA) designation. This approach emphasizes a systematic evaluation of the EMS against established criteria, including regulatory requirements and organizational objectives. It involves a combination of document review, interviews, and site observations to gather objective evidence. This methodology ensures that the audit addresses both compliance and performance aspects, providing a holistic assessment. It is ethically sound as it aims for thoroughness and accuracy, fulfilling the auditor's duty to provide a reliable opinion. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on verifying reported performance metrics without assessing the underlying EMS processes would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of due diligence and an over-reliance on potentially manipulated or incomplete data. It violates the ethical obligation to conduct a thorough and objective audit, as it fails to identify systemic issues that may be contributing to poor performance or noncompliance. Such an approach could lead to a false sense of security for the organization and its stakeholders, potentially exposing them to regulatory penalties or reputational damage. Another incorrect approach that involves conducting only a limited scope audit, such as a single-issue compliance check, would also be professionally unacceptable. While compliance is a critical component, it is insufficient on its own to provide a comprehensive understanding of environmental performance. This approach neglects the broader EMS and its effectiveness in preventing or mitigating environmental impacts. It fails to meet the expectations of a professional environmental audit, which should provide assurance on the overall environmental management system. A third incorrect approach that relies exclusively on third-party data without independent verification would be professionally unsound. While external data can be useful, an auditor has a responsibility to ensure the reliability and accuracy of all information used in the audit. Without independent verification, the auditor risks basing their conclusions on flawed or biased information, compromising the integrity of the audit findings. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the audit objectives, the scope of work, and the relevant regulatory framework. Auditors should begin by assessing the available information, including performance metrics, and then determine the most effective audit type and methodology to achieve the stated objectives. This often involves a risk-based approach, focusing on areas of higher potential noncompliance or environmental impact. A combination of methodologies, including document review, interviews, site inspections, and data analysis, is typically employed to gather sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Ethical considerations, such as independence, objectivity, and professional skepticism, must guide every step of the audit process. Question 4. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a facility can achieve compliance with its air emission permits using either a proven, moderately priced control technology or a newer, significantly less expensive technology with a less established track record for meeting stringent emission limits for volatile organic compounds, VOC, under the Clean Air Act. As a certified professional environmental auditor, which approach to evaluating the selection of this technology best aligns with professional practice and regulatory requirements. Option A. Recommend the newer, less expensive technology, assuming its projected performance is sufficient to maximize cost savings for the facility. Option B. Recommend the proven, moderately priced technology, ensuring it demonstrably meets or exceeds all applicable VOC emission limits and regulatory requirements, and then conduct a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis of compliant options. Option C. Recommend the proven, moderately priced technology solely because it is the most familiar option, without a detailed cost-benefit analysis of other compliant alternatives. Option D. Recommend the newer, less expensive technology based on its lower upfront cost, with a plan to monitor emissions closely and address any exceedances as they arise. The correct answer is A. Recommend the newer, less expensive technology, assuming its projected performance is sufficient to maximize cost savings for the facility. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a certified professional environmental auditor, CP, by requiring an evaluation of air pollution control technology selection based on a cost-benefit analysis within the specific regulatory framework of the United States, likely referencing the Clean Air Act, CA, and its associated regulations and guidance from the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. The challenge lies in balancing economic considerations with the stringent environmental protection mandates and the need for demonstrable compliance with air quality standards. A CP must ensure that the chosen technology not only meets cost-effectiveness criteria, but also achieves the required emission reductions to comply with National Ambient Air Quality Standards, NOx, and any applicable new source performance standards, NSPS, or National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, NESHAP. Correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes compliance with the CAA and EPA regulations as the foundational requirement. A cost-benefit analysis, when conducted correctly in this context, should evaluate the costs and benefits of technologies that already meet or exceed regulatory performance standards. This ensures that the chosen technology is both environmentally effective and economically viable. Aligning with the dual objectives of environmental auditing, the auditor must verify that the cost-benefit analysis explicitly considers the environmental benefits, e.g., improved air quality, reduced health impacts, and the costs of non-compliance, e.g., fines, reputational damage, potential facility shutdowns, in addition to capital and operational expenses. This holistic view ensures that the benefit side of the analysis is robust and directly linked to regulatory compliance and public health. An incorrect approach that solely focuses on the lowest capital or operational cost, without verifying the technology's ability to meet or exceed regulatory emission limits, is professionally unacceptable. This fails to uphold the auditor's ethical obligation to ensure compliance with environmental laws. Such an approach could lead to the selection of a technology that, while cheap, is ineffective in controlling pollution, resulting in ongoing noncompliance, potential enforcement actions by the EPA, and significant environmental harm. Another incorrect approach might be to prioritize a technology based on its perceived innovativeness, or green marketing, without rigorous verification of its actual performance against established regulatory benchmarks, and without a thorough cost-benefit assessment that includes all relevant factors. This can lead to overspending on unproven or unnecessarily complex solutions that do not offer a superior compliance outcome compared to more established, cost-effective technologies. Furthermore, an approach that neglects to consider the long-term operational costs, maintenance, and potential for future regulatory tightening would be flawed, as it fails to provide a comprehensive and sustainable solution. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of applicable federal and state air pollution control regulations. The auditor must then identify technologies that are known to meet or exceed these standards for the specific pollutant and source type. Only after establishing a baseline of compliant technologies should a cost-benefit analysis be performed. This analysis must be comprehensive, encompassing capital costs, operational and maintenance expenses, expected lifespan, energy consumption, waste disposal, and importantly, the quantifiable environmental benefits and the costs of non-compliance. The auditor should also consider the reliability and proven track record of the technology, as well as the vendor's support and warranty. The ultimate decision should be the one that offers the most effective and compliant environmental outcome at a reasonable and justifiable cost, as determined by a thorough and well-documented analysis. Question 5. Investigation of the most effective audit planning strategy for a CP candidate auditing a manufacturing facility with a history of minor environmental citations, considering the need to identify significant environmental risks and ensure compliance with applicable U.S. environmental regulations. Option A. Design an audit plan that emphasizes auditing easily accessible and well-documented environmental procedures, as these are typically the most straightforward to verify. Option B. Allocate the majority of audit resources to areas with historically low environmental risk, as these are less likely to present compliance challenges and require less in-depth scrutiny. Option C. Develop a detailed audit plan based on a comprehensive risk assessment that considers the facility's current operations, regulatory landscape, and potential environmental aspects, prioritizing areas with the highest likelihood of significant noncompliance or environmental impact. Option D. Focus the audit plan primarily on reviewing historical audit reports and previous citation data, assuming that past issues are the most likely to recur and require the most attention. The correct answer is C. Develop a detailed audit plan based on a comprehensive risk assessment that considers the facility's current operations, regulatory landscape, and potential environmental aspects, prioritizing areas with the highest likelihood of significant noncompliance or environmental impact. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in audit planning, balancing the need for comprehensive information gathering with the practical constraints of time and resources, while adhering to the specific requirements of the Certified Professional Environmental Auditor (CP) certification framework. The auditor must select an audit planning approach that is both effective in identifying significant environmental risks and compliant with the established professional standards for CP examinations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a risk-based methodology, which is a cornerstone of effective auditing. This involves understanding the auditee's operations, identifying potential environmental impacts and compliance obligations, and then allocating audit resources to areas of highest risk. This aligns with the principles of environmental auditing as outlined in relevant professional standards and regulatory guidance that emphasize efficiency and effectiveness in identifying and addressing environmental performance issues. It ensures that the audit is focused on areas where non-compliance or significant environmental impacts are most likely to occur, thereby maximizing the value of the audit. An incorrect approach that relies solely on historical audit findings without considering current operational changes or emerging regulatory requirements fails to adequately address the dynamic nature of environmental management. This could lead to overlooking new risks or significant deviations from compliance, violating the principle of conducting a thorough and relevant audit. Another incorrect approach that focuses exclusively on readily available documentation without engaging with operational personnel or conducting site observations would miss crucial insights into actual practices and potential gaps between documented procedures and on-the-ground implementation. This is a failure to gather sufficient appropriate audit evidence, a fundamental auditing requirement, an approach that prioritizes areas of low environmental risk simply because they are easier to audit would be inefficient and ineffective, failing to meet the objective of identifying significant environmental issues and potential noncompliance. This demonstrates a lack of professional judgment and a failure to adhere to the risk-based principles expected of a CP. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the audit objectives and scope. This should be followed by an assessment of the auditee's business context, regulatory environment, and potential environmental aspects. A risk assessment should then be conducted to identify areas of highest concern. The audit plan should be developed based on this risk assessment, detailing the audit procedures, resources, and timeline, ensuring that the plan is flexible enough to adapt to new information discovered during the audit. This systematic, risk-driven approach ensures that the audit is both comprehensive and efficient, meeting professional standards and regulatory expectations. Question 6. What factors determine the appropriate scope and methodology for conducting an environmental site assessment (ESA) under U.S. regulatory frameworks, specifically concerning the transition from Phase I to Phase II investigations? Option A. A predetermined sampling plan for all properties, regardless of Phase I finding, to ensure comprehensive coverage and minimize potential future liabilities. Option B. The client's budget constraints, which dictate the extent of historical research and site investigation activities performed. Option C. The perceived likelihood of contamination based solely on the current visual condition of the property during a brief site walkthrough. Option D. The identification of recognized environmental conditions, REC, during the Phase I ESA, supported by historical research, site reconnaissance, and interviews, which then dictates the necessity and focus of Phase II sampling. The correct answer is D. The identification of recognized environmental conditions, REC, during the Phase I ESA, supported by historical research, site reconnaissance, and interviews, which then dictates the necessity and focus of Phase II sampling. Explanation. The scenario of determining the appropriate scope and methodology for an environmental site assessment (ESA) is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of regulatory requirements, site-specific conditions, potential historical land uses, and the intended future use of the property. Auditors must balance the need for thoroughness to identify potential environmental liabilities with the practical considerations of cost and time. The challenge lies in making informed judgments that satisfy regulatory expectations, e.g., ASTM standards in the U.S., without over-engineering or under-investigating the site. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it is grounded in a systematic, risk-based methodology that aligns with established industry standards and regulatory expectations. This approach prioritizes the identification of recognized environmental conditions, REC, through a comprehensive review of historical records, site reconnaissance, and interviews, as mandated by frameworks like the U.S. EPA's All Appropriate Inquiries I Rule and ASTM E1527. When RECs are identified, the decision to proceed to Phase II is based on the potential for actual contamination, guided by the findings of Phase I. This tiered approach ensures that investigative resources are allocated efficiently and effectively, leading to a defensible assessment that protects the client from future environmental liabilities and complies with legal due diligence requirements. Incorrect approaches fail to meet professional standards and regulatory requirements. An approach that solely relies on a cursory visual inspection without historical research would be ethically and regulatorily deficient. It fails to address the core requirement of identifying potential historical sources of contamination, which is a fundamental component of due diligence and a primary objective of Phase I ESAs under AAI. Similarly, proceeding directly to extensive subsurface sampling, Phase II, without a thorough Phase I assessment to identify potential targets for investigation, is an inefficient and potentially wasteful use of resources. This approach lacks the necessary justification and could lead to unnecessary costs and inconclusive results, failing to meet the professional obligation to conduct a cost-effective and targeted investigation. Another incorrect approach might be to ignore potential RECs identified in Phase I based on subjective assumptions about low risk without further investigation or expert consultation. This demonstrates a failure to adhere to the precautionary principle and the professional duty to thoroughly investigate all identified potential environmental concerns, potentially leading to the overlooking of significant liabilities. Professional decision-making in ESA situations requires a structured process. This involves first understanding the specific regulatory context, e.g., U.S. EPA, ASTM standards. Second, a thorough review of all available information, including historical records, site characteristics, and intended property use, is crucial. Third, a risk assessment should be performed to prioritize potential environmental concerns. Fourth, the auditor must exercise professional judgment to determine the appropriate level of investigation, escalating from Phase I to Phase II, and potentially Phase III only when warranted by the findings of the preceding phase. Finally, clear documentation of the rationale behind all decisions is essential for defensibility and to demonstrate adherence to best practices. Question 7. When evaluating a facility's compliance with hazardous waste management regulations, an auditor discovers that two distinct federal regulations, each with different management and disposal requirements, appear to apply to a specific waste stream. One regulation is older but has more stringent containment requirements, while the other is more recent and has broader applicability but less stringent containment. Which approach best ensures compliance and upholds professional auditing standards? Option A. Apply the older regulation with the more stringent containment requirements, as it provides a higher level of environmental protection. Option B. Apply the regulation with the least burdensome compliance requirements to minimize costs for the facility. Option C. Apply the more recent regulation, assuming it supersedes the older one due to its later enactment date. Option D. Defer the decision to the facility's environmental manager, as they have the ultimate responsibility for compliance. The correct answer is A. Apply the older regulation with the more stringent containment requirements, as it provides a higher level of environmental protection. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge for environmental auditors, navigating the complexities of overlapping regulatory requirements and determining the most stringent standard to apply when multiple regulations appear relevant. The professional challenge lies in the auditor's responsibility to ensure compliance with all applicable laws and regulations, which requires a thorough understanding of their scope, applicability, and enforcement priorities. Misinterpreting or misapplying these regulations can lead to significant noncompliance, potential penalties, and reputational damage for the audited entity. Careful judgment is required to avoid both overcompliance, which can be inefficient, and undercompliance, which is a direct regulatory failure. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the most protective standard for human health and the environment, aligning with the overarching goals of environmental regulation. By identifying and applying the most stringent applicable requirement, the auditor ensures that the facility's operations meet the highest level of environmental protection mandated by law. This proactive stance demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to robust environmental stewardship, which is a core ethical and professional obligation for a certified professional environmental auditor. This approach also minimizes the risk of future enforcement actions by addressing the most demanding compliance obligations upfront. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the most recently enacted regulation, without considering its specific applicability or potential conflicts with older, more stringent standards, is professionally unacceptable. This could lead to a situation where a facility is operating under a less protective standard than is legally required, creating a compliance gap. Another incorrect approach, which involves applying the regulation with the least burdensome compliance requirements, directly contradicts the auditor's duty to ensure adherence to all applicable laws and ethical principles. This approach prioritizes cost saving over environmental protection and legal compliance, representing a significant ethical failure and a violation of professional standards. Finally, an approach that defers the decision to the client without providing a clear, reasoned recommendation based on regulatory analysis is a failure of professional responsibility. The auditor's role is to provide expert guidance and identify compliance obligations, not to abdicate that responsibility. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of all potentially applicable regulations, a detailed analysis of their scope and applicability to the specific operations being audited, and a comparative assessment of their requirements. When conflicts or overlaps exist, the auditor must determine which regulation imposes the most stringent obligations and apply that standard. This requires a deep understanding of regulatory intent and enforcement priorities. The auditor should document their rationale for selecting a particular standard and be prepared to justify their decision based on the regulatory framework. Question 8. Quality control measures reveal that during the closing meeting for an environmental audit, the auditor identified a significant noncompliance with a key environmental regulation. The client representative present at the meeting expresses concern about the immediate reputational impact and requests that the finding be presented in a less direct manner in the final report, suggesting it be framed as a recommendation for improvement rather than a direct noncompliance. The auditor has thoroughly documented the noncompliance with supporting evidence. What is the most appropriate course of action for the auditor? Option A. Clearly and factually communicate the identified noncompliance, supported by evidence, as a significant finding in the closing meeting, and ensure it is accurately reflected in the final audit report, regardless of the client's concerns about reputational impact. Option B. Omit the specific details of the noncompliance from the closing meeting discussion and the final report, intending to address it with the client through a separate, informal follow-up communication at a later date. Option C. Reframe the noncompliance as a general recommendation for improvement in the closing meeting and final report to mitigate the client's immediate reputational concerns, as the auditor aims to foster a positive client relationship. Option D. Downplay the severity of the noncompliance during the closing meeting, suggesting that it is a minor issue that can be resolved through informal discussions with the client's operational staff without formal documentation in the audit report. Correct answer is A. Clearly and factually communicate the identified noncompliance, supported by evidence, as a significant finding in the closing meeting, and ensure it is accurately reflected in the final audit report, regardless of the client's concerns about reputational impact. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where an auditor discovers a significant environmental noncompliance during the closing meeting phase. The challenge lies in balancing the auditor's duty to report findings accurately and comprehensively with the client's potential desire to mitigate immediate reputational damage, financial implications. The auditor must navigate this delicate situation while adhering strictly to professional standards and the specific regulatory framework governing the CPEA exam. The pressure to present findings in a way that is both informative and constructive, without compromising integrity or objectivity, is paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves clearly and factually communicating the identified noncompliance to the client during the closing meeting, as per the established audit plan and professional auditing standards. This communication should be supported by documented evidence and presented in a manner that facilitates understanding and discussion. This aligns with the CP emphasis on transparent and objective reporting, ensuring that all significant findings are brought to the attention of the auditee. The auditor's responsibility is to report what was found, not to manage the client's reaction or consequences. This upholds the auditor's professional integrity and the credibility of the audit process. Incorrect approaches analysis. Presenting the noncompliance in a vague or generalized manner, omitting specific details or evidence, constitutes a failure to meet the professional obligation of thorough and accurate reporting. This undermines the purpose of the audit, which is to identify and document specific issues. It also violates ethical principles of honesty and transparency. Downplaying the significance of the noncompliance or suggesting it can be addressed informally without formal documentation is a serious ethical breach. This misrepresents the findings and can lead to the noncompliance persisting, potentially resulting in future environmental harm or regulatory penalties for the client. It compromises the auditor's independence and objectivity. Withholding the noncompliance from the closing meeting report and intending to address it in a subsequent, less formal communication is a direct violation of audit protocols and professional standards. The closing meeting is the designated forum for presenting all material findings. Delaying or omitting such critical information erodes trust and can be interpreted as an attempt to shield the client from immediate accountability. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first consulting their audit plan and relevant professional standards. The auditor's primary duty is to the integrity of the audit process and the accurate reporting of findings. This involves a commitment to objectivity, honesty, and transparency. When faced with a potentially sensitive finding, the auditor should prepare to present it clearly, supported by evidence, and be ready to discuss its implications factually. The focus should remain on the facts and the regulatory requirements, allowing the client to determine their subsequent actions based on accurate information. Question 9. Market research demonstrates that clients are increasingly concerned about specific environmental risks related to their supply chain sustainability and emerging contaminants. As a CP preparing to audit a large manufacturing company with a complex global supply chain, what is the most effective approach to selecting and training your audit team to address these heightened concerns and ensure a robust audit? Option A. Assign a senior auditor to oversee a team of junior auditors who will learn about supply chain sustainability and emerging contaminants through on-the-job experience with minimal pre-audit preparation. Option B. Select team members based on their availability and general knowledge of environmental regulations, assuming they can acquire necessary specialized knowledge during the audit. Option C. Assemble a team with broad environmental auditing experience and provide general training on sustainability reporting frameworks and emerging contaminant identification. Option D. Prioritize team members with direct experience in the client's specific manufacturing sector and conduct targeted training on supply chain risk assessment and the latest scientific literature on emerging contaminants. The correct answer is C. Assemble a team with broad environmental auditing experience and provide general training on sustainability reporting frameworks and emerging contaminant identification. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because selecting an audit team with the appropriate expertise and ensuring their adequate training is foundational to the integrity and effectiveness of any environmental audit, particularly under the Certified Professional Environmental Auditor (CP) framework. The risk assessment approach mandates that the team's capabilities directly align with the identified risks of the audit subject. Failure to do so can lead to missed noncompliance, inaccurate findings, and ultimately, a compromised audit opinion, potentially exposing the client and the auditor to regulatory penalties and reputational damage. The pressure to complete audits efficiently can sometimes lead to shortcuts in team composition and training, making rigorous adherence to best practices crucial. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes a risk-based selection of team members whose existing knowledge and experience directly address the specific environmental risks identified for the client. This is followed by targeted training to fill any identified gaps. This aligns with the CP emphasis on competence and due professional care. The International Organization for Standardization, ISO standards, which often underpin environmental auditing practices and are implicitly referenced in professional auditor frameworks like CP, stress the importance of auditor competence, which is achieved through a combination of education, experience, and training relevant to the audit scope. A risk-based approach ensures that the audit team is not only qualified, but also specifically equipped to tackle the most critical environmental aspects of the client's operations, thereby maximizing the audit's effectiveness and efficiency in identifying and assessing risks. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves selecting team members based solely on their availability and general environmental knowledge, without a specific risk assessment. This fails to ensure that the team possesses the specialized expertise required to audit the client's unique environmental risks, such as those related to hazardous waste management or air emissions, if those are the identified high-risk areas. This can lead to superficial assessments and missed critical noncompliance issues, violating the principle of due professional care and potentially leading to an inaccurate audit report. Another incorrect approach is to assume that general environmental training is sufficient for all audits, neglecting the need for specific training tailored to the client's industry, regulatory landscape, and identified risks. This approach overlooks the dynamic nature of environmental regulations and industry-specific challenges. Without targeted training, team members may not be aware of the latest regulatory requirements or best practices relevant to the audit subject, increasing the likelihood of overlooking significant compliance gaps. This demonstrates a lack of proactive risk management and can result in an audit that does not meet the required standard of professional competence. A third incorrect approach is to prioritize cost-effectiveness by selecting junior auditors with minimal experience and relying heavily on on-the-job learning during the audit itself, without adequate supervision or pre-audit training. While cost is a consideration, it should not compromise the quality and competence of the audit team. This approach significantly elevates the risk of errors, omissions, and an incomplete audit. It fails to meet the professional standards of competence and due diligence expected of a CP, potentially leading to an audit that is not only ineffective but also misleading. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic, risk-based approach to team selection and training. This involves 1. Conducting a thorough risk assessment of the client's operations to identify key environmental risks and regulatory compliance areas. 2. Evaluating the identified risks against the existing competencies of potential team members. 3. Identifying any knowledge or skill gaps. 4. Developing and delivering targeted training to address these gaps, ensuring the team is adequately prepared for the specific audit. 5. Continuously monitoring team performance and providing ongoing support. This structured process ensures that the audit team is competent, efficient, and capable of delivering a high-quality, risk-focused audit that meets professional and regulatory expectations. Question 10. Process analysis reveals a significant environmental noncompliance event at a manufacturing facility. As the Certified Professional Environmental Auditor (CP), you are tasked with developing and tracking a corrective action plan (CAP). Considering the diverse interests of internal management, operational staff, local community representatives, and the regulatory agency, which approach to CAP development and tracking best aligns with U.S. environmental regulatory frameworks and professional auditing ethics. Option A. Focus on a rapid CAP development to satisfy the immediate regulatory deadline, with tracking limited to ensuring the plan is submitted on time, deferring detailed implementation and long-term effectiveness assessment to a later date. Option B. Design a CAP through a collaborative process involving all identified stakeholders to ensure technical feasibility, operational integration, and community acceptance, establishing clear, measurable performance indicators for tracking progress and effectiveness, with regular reporting to all parties. Option C. Create a CAP based solely on the recommendations of the facility's legal counsel to minimize potential litigation risks, with tracking mechanisms primarily focused on documenting legal compliance rather than broader environmental performance. Option D. Develop a CAP that prioritizes the most cost-effective immediate remediation measures, with tracking focused on confirming completion of these specific tasks and present it to stakeholders for minimal feedback. Correct answer is D. Develop a CAP that prioritizes the most cost-effective immediate remediation measures, with tracking focused on confirming completion of these specific tasks, and present it to stakeholders for minimal feedback. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for corrective action with the long-term sustainability and effectiveness of the plan, all while managing diverse stakeholder expectations. The Certified Professional Environmental Auditor (CP) must ensure the corrective action plan (CAP) not only addresses the identified noncompliance, but also integrates seamlessly with existing operational procedures and future environmental goals, adhering strictly to the relevant U.S. regulatory framework, such as the EPA's guidance on corrective action under RCRA or CERCLA, as applicable. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a collaborative development process involving all key stakeholders. This ensures buy-in, leverages diverse expertise, and leads to a CAP that is technically sound, operationally feasible, and legally compliant. It aligns with the ethical obligation of an auditor to promote effective environmental management and compliance. This approach fosters transparency and accountability, crucial elements for successful remediation and preventing recurrence, as implicitly or explicitly required by various environmental statutes and regulations that mandate demonstrable efforts towards environmental protection and compliance. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the cheapest immediate fix fails to consider long-term liability, potential for recurrence, and stakeholder concern, potentially violating the spirit and letter of regulations that require effective and sustainable solutions. This could lead to future enforcement actions and increased costs. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over thoroughness risks developing an incomplete or ineffective CAP, which could result in continued environmental harm and regulatory penalties. This neglects the due diligence expected of a professional auditor. An approach that ignores stakeholder input, particularly from affected communities or regulatory agencies, can lead to significant implementation challenges, legal disputes, and a breakdown in trust, undermining the overall environmental management system and potentially contravening principles of public participation often embedded in environmental law. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic approach. First, thoroughly understand the regulatory requirements and the scope of the noncompliance. Second, identify all relevant stakeholders and their interests. Third, develop a CAP that is technically robust, economically viable, and socially responsible. Fourth, establish clear tracking mechanisms with measurable performance indicators. And finally, communicate progress and challenges transparently to all stakeholders. This iterative process ensures that the CAP is not just a document, but a living plan that drives continuous improvement in environmental performance. Question 11. Process analysis reveals that an environmental audit is scheduled for a manufacturing facility. The auditor's initial plan is to meet with the facility's environmental manager to discuss the audit scope and objectives, followed by a site walkthrough focused on areas identified by the environmental manager. The auditor intends to inform other department heads of the audit's commencement via email after the initial meeting. Which of the following approaches best aligns with professional auditing standards and regulatory expectations for the opening meeting and site walkthrough? Option A. Proceed directly to a detailed site walkthrough with the environmental manager, focusing on specific compliance documentation, and defer the opening meeting until preliminary findings are identified. Option B. Inform all department heads via email about the audit's commencement and its general objectives, then conduct an opening meeting solely with the environmental manager and a subsequent walkthrough based on their provided itinerary. Option C. Schedule a brief opening meeting with the environmental manager to outline the audit's purpose, and then conduct a walkthrough of only the waste treatment areas, as these are typically the most critical from an environmental perspective. Option D. Conduct a formal opening meeting with representatives from all relevant departments, e.g., operations, maintenance, production, environmental, to clearly define the audit scope, objectives, and schedule, followed by a comprehensive site walkthrough that allows for initial observations and inquiries across various operational areas. The correct answer is D. Conduct a formal opening meeting with representatives from all relevant departments, e.g., operations, maintenance, production, environmental, to clearly define the audit scope, objectives, and schedule, followed by a comprehensive site walkthrough that allows for initial observations and inquiries across various operational areas. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental auditors, balancing the need for efficient information gathering during an opening meeting and site walkthrough with the ethical and regulatory imperative to ensure all relevant parties are informed and have an opportunity to participate. The professional challenge lies in managing stakeholder expectations and ensuring transparency without compromising the audit's integrity or scope. Careful judgment is required to determine the appropriate level of detail and inclusiveness at this early stage. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes clear communication and stakeholder engagement as mandated by general auditing principles, and implied within the spirit of environmental regulatory frameworks that encourage transparency and cooperation. By informing all relevant departments about the audit's purpose, scope, and schedule, and by explicitly inviting their participation in the opening meeting and site walkthrough, the auditor fosters an environment of trust and facilitates access to necessary information and personnel. This proactive communication helps prevent misunderstandings, potential resistance, and ensures that the audit team can effectively observe and inquire about all relevant environmental aspects of the facility. This aligns with the ethical duty of due professional care and the regulatory expectation of cooperation with auditors. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on meeting with the designated environmental manager without informing other departments fails to uphold the principle of comprehensive stakeholder engagement. This can lead to operational disruptions, lack of cooperation from other departments who feel blindsided, and potentially incomplete information gathering, as key personnel in operations, maintenance, or production might possess critical environmental compliance knowledge. Ethically, this approach could be seen as circumventing proper organizational communication channels and potentially creating an adversarial relationship. Another incorrect approach, which involves conducting a brief, superficial walkthrough without a formal opening meeting, neglects the foundational step of establishing the audit's parameters and objectives with the auditee. This can result in the auditor missing crucial areas or failing to understand the context of observed conditions. It also bypasses the opportunity to clarify scope, address initial concerns, and build rapport, which are essential for a productive audit. This approach demonstrates a lack of due professional care and may not meet the implicit requirements of a structured audit process. A third incorrect approach, which involves extensively detailing all potential noncompliance issues during the opening meeting and walkthrough, is premature and unprofessional. The opening meeting and walkthrough are for establishing scope, objectives, and initial observations, not for delivering a preliminary findings report. This can create undue anxiety, defensiveness, and bias among the auditee, potentially hindering further cooperation and objective assessment. It also risks making definitive judgments before all evidence has been gathered and analyzed, violating the principle of impartiality. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve 1. Identifying all key stakeholders within the auditee organization who have a role in environmental management or operations. 2. Planning for a formal opening meeting to clearly articulate the audit's purpose, scope, objectives, methodology, and schedule. 3. Explicitly inviting representatives from all relevant departments to the opening meeting and site walkthrough. 4. During the walkthrough, focusing on observation, initial inquiries, and understanding the operational context, while deferring detailed findings and conclusions to the audit reporting phase. 5. Maintaining open communication channels throughout the audit process. Question 12. The efficiency study reveals that the environmental management system at a chemical manufacturing plant is experiencing an increase in minor spills and a backlog in waste manifest tracking. As a certified professional environmental auditor, CP, tasked with auditing this system, which approach best aligns with the principles of ISO 19011 for assessing the significance of these findings. Option A. Focus on the financial implications of the spills and tracking delays, as this is the primary concern for the manufacturing plant's management. Option B. Document every single minor spill and delay in waste manifest tracking, regardless of volume or frequency, to ensure a comprehensive record of all deviations. Option C. Assume that the increased spills are due to a single, easily identifiable equipment malfunction, and that the waste manifest backlog is a minor administrative oversight with no significant environmental implications. Option D. Prioritize the investigation and reporting of findings based on their potential to impact the organization's environmental objectives and legal compliance, using a risk-based methodology to determine the severity and scope of corrective actions. The correct answer is D. Prioritize the investigation and reporting of findings based on their potential to impact the organization's environmental objectives and legal compliance, using a risk-based methodology to determine the severity and scope of corrective actions. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals potential nonconformities in the environmental management system, EMS, of a manufacturing facility. This scenario is professionally challenging because the auditor must not only identify deviations from the EMS, but also assess their significance in relation to the organization's environmental objectives and legal requirements, all while adhering to ISO 19011 principles. The auditor's judgment is critical in determining the root causes and the potential impact of these findings. The correct approach, focusing on risk assessment as guided by ISO 19011, represents best professional practice because it prioritizes audit resources towards areas of greatest potential environmental impact and noncompliance. ISO 19011 emphasizes a risk-based approach to auditing, which means the auditor should consider the likelihood and consequence of potential nonconformities. By evaluating the findings in the context of the organization's environmental risks, the auditor can provide more relevant and valuable feedback, helping the organization to focus on improving its most critical environmental aspects. This aligns with the ethical obligation of an auditor to provide a service that adds value and promotes continual improvement. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on documenting every minor deviation without considering its potential impact or risk fails to adhere to the spirit and intent of ISO 19011. This approach can lead to an overwhelming number of findings that may not be significant, diverting attention from more critical issues. Ethically, this is a failure to provide an efficient and effective audit. Another incorrect approach, which involves making assumptions about the root cause without sufficient evidence or investigation, violates the principle of objective evidence, a cornerstone of auditing. This can lead to inaccurate conclusions and recommendations, potentially causing the organization to implement ineffective corrective actions and failing to address the true underlying problems. This also represents a failure in professional competence and due care. Professionals should approach similar situations by first understanding the audit scope and objectives. They should then apply a risk-based methodology, as outlined in ISO 19011, to plan and conduct the audit. This involves identifying potential risks to the EMS and the environment, and then focusing audit activities on areas where these risks are highest. When findings are identified, the auditor must gather sufficient, appropriate evidence to support their conclusions and assess the significance of the finding in the context of the organization's risks and objectives. Finally, recommendations should be practical, actionable, and aimed at promoting continual improvement. Question 13. The evaluation methodology shows a tendency to develop audit protocols and checklists by primarily referencing a broad, generic environmental compliance checklist that has been used across various industries, with minimal adaptation to the specific operational processes and unique environmental aspects of the manufacturing facility being audited. Which of the following approaches to developing the audit protocol and checklist would best align with the principles of professional environmental auditing and the requirements for a certified professional environmental auditor, CPEA? Option A. Utilize a comprehensive, pre-existing generic environmental compliance checklist that covers a wide range of potential environmental issues, assuming that most relevant requirements will be captured by its broad scope. Option B. Focus the audit protocol and checklist exclusively on the most recently published environmental regulations, ensuring that all current legal mandates are addressed, even if they do not directly relate to the auditee's primary operational activities. Option C. Rely heavily on the auditor's prior experience auditing similar facilities, applying a checklist that reflects those past audit findings and perceived common areas of noncompliance, with limited specific investigation into the auditee's current operational context. Option D. Conduct a detailed review of the auditee's specific manufacturing processes, identify their significant environmental aspects and impacts, and then develop a tailored audit protocol and checklist that incorporates relevant regulatory requirements, industry best practices, and the identified risks specific to the facility. The correct answer is D. Conduct a detailed review of the auditee's specific manufacturing processes, identify their significant environmental aspects and impacts, and then develop a tailored audit protocol and checklist that incorporates relevant regulatory requirements, industry best practices, and the identified risks specific to the facility. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a common challenge in environmental auditing: developing audit protocols and checklists that are both comprehensive and practical for the specific operational context of the auditee. The professional challenge lies in balancing the need to cover all relevant regulatory requirements and best practices with the reality of limited audit time and resources, and the auditee's operational constraints. A well-designed protocol ensures that the audit is focused, efficient, and effective in identifying potential noncompliance and areas for improvement. Correct approach represents best professional practice because it involves a systematic and iterative process of understanding the auditee's operations and then tailoring the audit protocol to those specific activities and associated environmental risks. This ensures that the audit is relevant, targeted, and likely to uncover significant findings. It aligns with the principles of professional auditing, which emphasize risk-based approaches and thorough preparation. Specifically, it adheres to the CPEA emphasis on understanding the auditee's context and regulatory landscape to develop a robust audit plan. An incorrect approach that relies solely on generic checklists without considering the auditee's specific operations fails to address the unique environmental aspects and risks present. This can lead to an audit that is either too broad and superficial, missing critical issues, or too narrow and irrelevant, wasting audit resources. Ethically, it can be seen as a failure to exercise due professional care and diligence, as the auditor has not adequately prepared to assess the auditee's specific environmental performance. Another incorrect approach that focuses exclusively on the most recent regulatory updates, without integrating them into the auditor's existing management systems and operational realities, can result in a protocol that is technically accurate but practically unworkable. This overlooks the importance of assessing the effectiveness of the auditor's implementation of those regulations within their specific context. It can also lead to an audit that is perceived as overly punitive rather than constructive. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes the auditor's personal experience and pre-existing biases over a thorough understanding of the auditor's specific regulatory obligations and operational context is professionally unsound. This can lead to a biased audit, where findings are driven by the auditor's assumptions rather than objective evidence. It violates the principles of objectivity and impartiality essential for professional auditing. Professional decision-making process for developing audit protocols should involve 1. A thorough understanding of the auditor's industry, operations, and site-specific environmental aspects. 2. A comprehensive review of all applicable federal, state, and local environmental regulations, as well as relevant industry standards and best practices. 3. A risk assessment to identify the most significant environmental aspects and potential compliance gaps. 4. The development of specific audit objectives and criteria. 5. The creation of detailed audit questions and checklists that are tailored to the auditor's context and designed to gather sufficient appropriate audit evidence. And 6. A review and refinement of the protocol based on initial findings or changes in the auditor's operations or regulatory environment. Question 14. The assessment process reveals a newly identified hazardous waste stream at a facility operating under U.S. EPA regulations. The waste is a complex mixture of solvents and metal plating residues. The facility has historically disposed of similar, though not identical, waste streams on site without issue. The environmental manager is considering several approaches to manage this new waste stream to comply with land disposal restrictions, LDR. Which approach best ensures regulatory compliance and environmental protection? Option A. Assume the waste stream is exempt from LDRs because it is generated from routine operational processes and does not appear to be A-listed hazardous waste. Option B. Continue the historical practice of on-site disposal for this waste stream, assuming it is similar enough to previously accepted waste to also be compliant with LDRs. Option C. Conduct a thorough characterization of the new waste stream to identify all underlying hazardous constituents and their concentrations. Then compare these to the applicable LDR treatment standards and underlying hazardous constituents, OOC, to determine if treatment is required before land disposal. Option D. Prioritize the least expensive disposal option available, as long as it is a permitted hazardous waste disposal facility, to minimize operational costs. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough characterization of the new waste stream to identify all underlying hazardous constituents and their concentrations, then compare these to the applicable LDR treatment standards and underlying hazardous constituents, OOC, to determine if treatment is required before land disposal. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a complex situation regarding land disposal restrictions, LDR, for a facility generating hazardous waste. The challenge lies in interpreting and applying the specific treatment standards and underlying hazardous constituents, OOC, to a newly identified waste stream. This requires a deep understanding of the regulatory framework to ensure compliance and avoid significant environmental and legal repercussions. Careful judgment is essential to correctly categorize the waste, determine applicable treatment standards, and implement appropriate management practices. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core requirements of the LDR regulations. It involves a thorough technical evaluation of the waste stream, including characterization of its constituents and their concentrations, to determine if it meets the specified treatment standards or if further treatment is necessary before land disposal. This aligns with the principle of ensuring that hazardous wastes are treated to reduce their toxicity or mobility to acceptable levels, thereby protecting human health and the environment. This approach is rooted in the regulatory mandate to manage hazardous wastes responsibly and prevent the contamination of land and groundwater. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on historical disposal practices fails to acknowledge the dynamic nature of waste characterization and the evolving regulatory requirements. LDRs are designed to prevent the disposal of untreated hazardous waste, and relying on past practices that may not have met current standards is a direct violation of the regulations. This approach demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the protective intent of LDRs. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes cost-effectiveness over regulatory compliance is ethically and legally unsound. While cost considerations are a factor in waste management, they can never supersede the legal obligations to protect human health and the environment. This approach risks significant penalties, reputational damage, and potential environmental harm. A third incorrect approach that assumes all waste streams are automatically exempt from LDRs without proper verification is negligent. Regulatory exemptions are specific and require rigorous documentation and justification. A blanket assumption is a failure to perform the necessary due diligence mandated by the regulations. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a systematic, risk-based approach. First, thoroughly understand the specific regulatory requirements of the applicable jurisdiction, in this case, U.S. EPA regulations under RCRA. Second, meticulously characterize the waste stream, identifying all hazardous constituents and their concentrations. Third, consult the relevant treatment standards and UHCs to determine compliance. Fourth, if non-compliant, identify and implement appropriate treatment technologies. Fifth, maintain comprehensive documentation of all assessments, decisions, and treatment activities. Finally, seek expert consultation when faced with complex or ambiguous situations. Question 15. Benchmark analysis indicates that a manufacturing facility has experienced several historical spills of hazardous materials. The auditor is tasked with assessing potential environmental liabilities and the feasibility of recovering remediation costs from third parties. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the auditor's responsibilities under the relevant regulatory framework for environmental auditing? Option A. Assume that all historical spills, regardless of documentation, represent significant liabilities and that cost recovery is unlikely due to the age of the incidents. Option B. Rely solely on management's verbal assurances regarding the completeness of spill reporting and the adequacy of provisions for potential remediation costs. Option C. Prioritize the review of current operational permits and compliance records, considering historical spills as minor issues unless explicitly reported as ongoing enforcement actions. Option D. Focus on identifying all documented remediation activities and associated invoices, and assess the likelihood of recovering costs based on contractual agreements and any insurance policies in place, while also considering the statute of limitations for claims. The correct answer is D. Focus on identifying all documented remediation activities and associated invoices, and assess the likelihood of recovering costs based on contractual agreements and any insurance policies in place, while also considering the statute of limitations for claims. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an auditor to navigate the complexities of environmental liability and cost recovery under the specific regulatory framework governing the Certified Professional Environmental Auditor (CPEA) exam. The auditor must not only identify potential liabilities, but also assess the feasibility and appropriateness of cost recovery mechanisms, which often involve intricate legal and financial considerations. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between actual, contingent, and potential liabilities, and to evaluate the evidence supporting cost recovery claims. Correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the principles of thoroughness, objectivity, and adherence to the governing regulatory framework. It involves a systematic evaluation of all relevant documentation, including contracts, permits, incident reports, and financial records, to identify and quantify environmental liabilities. Furthermore, it necessitates an assessment of the legal and contractual basis for cost recovery, ensuring that any claims are well substantiated and comply with applicable laws and regulations. This approach upholds the auditor's professional responsibility to provide an accurate and reliable assessment of the entity's environmental performance and financial exposure. Incorrect approaches fail to meet professional standards due to several regulatory and ethical failures. One incorrect approach might involve making assumptions about liability or cost recovery without sufficient supporting evidence. This violates the principle of professional skepticism and can lead to misstatements in the audit report, potentially exposing the client to unforeseen financial risks or regulatory penalties. Another incorrect approach could be to solely rely on management representations without independent verification, which is a breach of auditing standards requiring corroboration of information. This can result in overlooking material misstatements or noncompliance. Third incorrect approach might be to ignore or downplay potential liabilities due to their complexity or the difficulty in quantifying them. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to fulfill the auditor's mandate to identify and report on significant environmental risks. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, clearly define the scope of the audit concerning liability and cost recovery. Second, gather and critically evaluate all relevant evidence, seeking corroboration from multiple sources. Third, consult with legal counsel or other subject matter experts when dealing with complex legal or financial aspects of liabilities and cost recovery. Fourth, document all findings, analyses, and conclusions meticulously, ensuring transparency and audit trail integrity. Finally, communicate findings clearly and objectively in the audit report, highlighting any significant risks or areas for improvement. Question 16. The control framework reveals that an environmental auditor is tasked with assessing a manufacturing facility's compliance with national environmental regulations. Several external parties have expressed interest in the audit's outcomes, including a local community action group concerned about air emissions, a regional environmental protection agency responsible for enforcement, and a national industry association advocating for best practices. Which approach to stakeholder communication and coordination best aligns with professional auditing standards and regulatory expectations for a comprehensive and credible audit? Option A. Prioritize communication exclusively with the auditee organization and the regional environmental protection agency, as they are the primary parties with direct regulatory and operational oversight. Option B. Develop a comprehensive stakeholder communication plan that identifies key stakeholders, their interests, and appropriate communication channels, and proactively engage them throughout the audit process, from planning to reporting. Option C. Engage in informal ad hoc conversations with stakeholders as opportunities arise, without a structured communication plan or defined reporting intervals. Option D. Inform all identified stakeholders of the audit's final report and findings only after the audit is completed and the report has been finalized. The correct answer is B. Develop a comprehensive stakeholder communication plan that identifies key stakeholders, their interests, and appropriate communication channels, and proactively engage them throughout the audit process, from planning to reporting. Explanation. The control framework reveals a common challenge in environmental auditing: effectively managing diverse stakeholder expectations and ensuring their input is integrated into the audit process and findings. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the auditor to balance the need for comprehensive information gathering with the practicalities of managing multiple, potentially conflicting interests. The auditor must ensure that communication is transparent, timely, and addresses the specific concerns of each stakeholder group without compromising the audit's objectivity or scope. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a proactive and inclusive engagement strategy. By establishing a clear communication plan that identifies key stakeholders, their interests, and appropriate communication channels, the auditor ensures that relevant information is shared and feedback is solicited systematically. This aligns with the principles of good governance and ethical auditing, fostering trust and credibility among stakeholders. It also enhances the audit's effectiveness by providing a broader perspective and identifying potential issues that might otherwise be overlooked. This systematic approach is implicitly supported by general auditing standards that emphasize effective communication and stakeholder engagement to achieve audit objectives. An incorrect approach that involves only informing stakeholders of the final report after its completion fails to meet the standards of effective communication and stakeholder engagement. This reactive approach can lead to surprises, distrust, and a perception that stakeholder concerns were not genuinely considered. It misses opportunities to gather valuable insights during the audit process and can result in challenges to the audit findings. Ethically, it falls short of the transparency expected in professional auditing. Another incorrect approach, which is to prioritize communication only with the auditee organization while excluding other relevant stakeholders, creates an imbalance. This can lead to a skewed understanding of the environmental performance and risks, as the perspectives of community groups, regulatory bodies, or non-governmental organizations are vital for a holistic assessment. Such selective communication can undermine the audit's credibility and its ability to identify all material environmental issues, potentially leading to noncompliance with broader environmental stewardship expectations. A further incorrect approach, which is to engage in informal ad hoc communication without a structured plan, risks miscommunication, misinformation, and inconsistent messaging. This lack of a defined strategy can lead to misunderstandings about the audit's purpose, scope, and findings, and may result in some stakeholders feeling excluded or ignored. It deviates from professional standards that advocate for organized and documented communication processes. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic identification of all relevant stakeholders, an assessment of their interests and potential impact on the audit, and the development of a tailored communication strategy. This strategy should outline the frequency, method, and content of communication for each stakeholder group, ensuring transparency and opportunities for input throughout the audit lifecycle. Regular review and adaptation of the communication plan based on evolving circumstances are also crucial. Question 17. The risk matrix shows a high likelihood of a hazardous substance migrating from a former industrial site, but the potential receptor population is currently undefined, and the exposure pathways are not fully characterized. Which approach to risk assessment is most appropriate under CERCLA for guiding further investigation and potential response actions? Option A. Focus on immediate containment measures based on the high likelihood of migration, deferring detailed receptor and pathway analysis until after initial remediation efforts. Option B. Rely on the existing data indicating a high likelihood of migration to initiate a broad presumptive cleanup strategy without further site-specific risk characterization. Option C. Prioritize detailed characterization of potential receptors and exposure pathways to refine the risk assessment and determine the necessity and scope of response actions. Option D. Conduct a cost-benefit analysis to determine if the potential risks warrant the expense of further investigation into receptors and pathways. The correct answer is C. Prioritize detailed characterization of potential receptors and exposure pathways to refine the risk assessment and determine the necessity and scope of response actions. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an environmental auditor to interpret a risk matrix in the context of CERCLA, specifically focusing on the approach to risk assessment for potential contamination. The auditor must go beyond simply identifying risks and instead evaluate the appropriateness of the methodology used to characterize those risks, considering the legal and regulatory requirements of CERCLA. The core challenge lies in distinguishing between a technically sound risk assessment and one that aligns with CERCLA mandate for identifying and addressing environmental hazards. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the fundamental requirements of CERCLA for risk assessment. CERCLA mandates a thorough evaluation of potential threats to human health and the environment. A risk assessment that prioritizes the identification of potential receptors and exposure pathways, and then quantifies the likelihood and severity of adverse effects based on scientific data and established methodologies, is essential for determining the scope and nature of response actions. This aligns with the precautionary principle inherent in CERCLA and ensures that decisions are based on a robust understanding of potential harm. The focus on site-specific conditions and the potential for migration of contaminants is critical for accurate CERCLA decision-making. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the presence of hazardous substances without considering exposure pathways or receptor populations fails to meet CERCLA requirements. CERCLA is concerned with actual or potential harm, not just the existence of chemicals. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes cost-effectiveness over a comprehensive risk characterization would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. CERCLA's primary objective is protection of human health and the environment, and cost cannot supersede this mandate in the initial risk assessment phase. Furthermore, an approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or unsubstantiated assumptions rather than scientific data and established risk assessment protocols would be professionally unacceptable, as it undermines the integrity and defensibility of the assessment required under CERCLA. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the specific objectives of the risk assessment within the CERCLA framework. This involves identifying the relevant regulatory guidance, e.g., EPA guidance on Superfund risk assessment. It should then critically evaluate the methodology employed, ensuring it addresses all necessary components: hazard identification, dose response assessment, exposure assessment, and risk characterization. The decision-making process should prioritize scientific defensibility, regulatory compliance, and the protection of human health and the environment, using the risk matrix as a tool to guide the assessment rather than as the sole determinant of action. Question 18. The audit findings indicate a significant discrepancy between the documented environmental performance data submitted by the client for review and the observations made during site inspections regarding waste management practices. The client's representative has expressed concern that a fully transparent reporting of this discrepancy could negatively impact their upcoming regulatory compliance review, and has subtly suggested that the auditor might consider contextualizing the findings. What is the most appropriate course of action for the certified professional environmental auditor in this situation? Option A. Immediately report the discrepancy to the relevant environmental regulatory agency without further discussion with the client. Option B. Document the discrepancy thoroughly in the audit report, clearly stating the observed conditions and the conflicting submitted data, and request a formal explanation from the client for the variance, outlining the potential implications of the discrepancy for their environmental management system. Option C. Overlook the discrepancy in the final report to maintain a positive client relationship and avoid jeopardizing future audit opportunities. Option D. Adjust the audit findings to align with the client's submitted data, assuming the client has a valid reason for the difference that is not immediately apparent. Correct answer is B. Document the discrepancy thoroughly in the audit report, clearly stating the observed conditions and the conflicting submitted data, and request a formal explanation from the client for the variance, outlining the potential implications of the discrepancy for their environmental management system. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the conflict between achieving audit objectives and maintaining professional integrity when faced with potential client pressure or misrepresentation. The auditor must balance the need to accurately report findings with the client's desire to present a favorable image, all while adhering to the ethical principles and regulatory requirements governing environmental auditing. Careful judgment is required to navigate this situation without compromising the audit's credibility or the auditor's professional standing. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the integrity of the audit process and adherence to professional standards. By clearly documenting the discrepancy and seeking clarification from the client, the auditor upholds the principle of objectivity and professional skepticism. This aligns with the ethical codes of conduct for environmental auditors, which mandate honesty, integrity, and due professional care. Furthermore, it respects the regulatory framework by ensuring that the audit report accurately reflects the environmental conditions and management system performance, preventing the dissemination of misleading information. An incorrect approach that involves overlooking the discrepancy to maintain a positive client relationship would be a failure of professional skepticism and objectivity. This could lead to an inaccurate audit report, potentially misleading stakeholders and regulators about the true environmental performance of the facility. It violates the ethical duty to report truthfully and accurately. Another incorrect approach, such as immediately escalating the issue to regulators without attempting to resolve it with the client, might be premature and could damage the auditor-client relationship unnecessarily, potentially hindering future cooperation and improvement efforts, while also not fully exploring the client's intent or potential for correction. A third incorrect approach, fabricating or altering data to align with the client's desired outcome, is a severe ethical breach and a direct violation of professional standards and potentially regulatory requirements for accurate reporting, constituting professional misconduct. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the discrepancy and its potential implications. This is followed by gathering all relevant evidence and understanding the context. The next step involves communicating concerns clearly and professionally with the client, seeking explanations and opportunities for correction. If resolution is not achieved, the auditor must then consider the implications for the audit report and their professional obligations, escalating or modifying their reporting as necessary based on the specific regulatory and ethical guidelines applicable to their jurisdiction and professional body. Question 19. The monitoring system demonstrates a consistent pattern of exceeding permitted discharge limits for a specific pollutant over the past quarter. The facility manager asserts that these exceedances were solely due to a temporary, undocumented equipment malfunction that has since been rectified, and requests that the audit report reflect this as a historical, resolved issue without further independent verification of the current operational status. As the certified professional environmental auditor, what is the most ethically sound and professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Immediately report the exceedances as ongoing noncompliance to the relevant regulatory authority without further discussion with the facility manager or independent verification. Option B. Conduct independent sampling and analysis to verify the current operational status of the equipment and confirm that discharge limits are now being met, while also reviewing maintenance and repair records related to the alleged malfunction. Option C. Document the exceedances as reported by the monitoring system and include the facility manager's explanation as a mitigating factor in the audit report without independent verification of the current operational status. Option D. Accept the facility manager's assurance that the issue is resolved and report the exceedances as historical, noting the manager's explanation without further investigation. The correct answer is B. Conduct independent sampling and analysis to verify the current operational status of the equipment and confirm that discharge limits are now being met, while also reviewing maintenance and repair records related to the alleged malfunction. Explanation. The monitoring system demonstrates a consistent pattern of exceeding permitted discharge limits for a specific pollutant, but the facility manager attributes these exceedances to a temporary equipment malfunction that has since been rectified. This scenario presents a significant ethical challenge for the environmental auditor. The auditor must balance the need for accurate reporting of noncompliance with the facility's claims of a resolved issue and potential reputational damage. The auditor's professional responsibility is to ensure compliance with all applicable environmental regulations and to maintain the integrity of their audit findings. The correct approach involves a thorough, independent verification of the facility's claims. This includes reviewing maintenance logs, calibration records, and potentially conducting independent sampling to confirm that the equipment is functioning correctly and that discharge limits are now being met. This approach upholds the auditor's ethical duty of due care and professional skepticism, ensuring that findings are based on objective evidence rather than unsubstantiated assurances. It aligns with the principles of professional conduct for environmental auditors, which emphasize accuracy, objectivity, and integrity. An incorrect approach would be to accept the facility manager's explanation without independent verification. This would be a failure of due care and professional skepticism, potentially leading to an inaccurate audit report that misrepresents the facility's compliance status. Ethically, this could be seen as complicity in misleading regulatory bodies or stakeholders. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately report the exceedances as ongoing noncompliance without investigating the facility's claims of a temporary issue. While reporting noncompliance is crucial, a failure to investigate and consider mitigating circumstances could be seen as a lack of fairness and an incomplete audit process, potentially damaging the auditor's professional reputation and the auditor-client relationship. Professionals should approach such situations by first gathering all available data, then engaging in open but objective communication with the auditee to understand their perspective and propose solutions. Crucially, independent verification of any claims of corrective action is paramount. This systematic process of evidence gathering, objective assessment, and transparent reporting ensures that audit findings are reliable and ethically sound. Question 20. The efficiency study reveals a significant increase in wastewater discharge volume from a chemical processing plant, exceeding historical averages and approaching permitted limits. The auditor needs to assess the environmental implications and recommend corrective actions. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the Certified Professional Environmental Auditor (CPEA) standards for assessing industry-specific standards and best practices in this scenario? Option A. Evaluate the plant's wastewater treatment processes and operational procedures against established industry best practices for chemical manufacturing, considering relevant U.S. EPA regulations and guidance documents for similar facilities. Option B. Compare the current discharge volume to the plant's historical data and identify any trends that might indicate a problem. Option C. Assume the increased discharge is a temporary anomaly and recommend monitoring without immediate investigation into the root cause. Option D. Focus on the financial implications of increased wastewater treatment costs and recommend operational changes solely based on cost reduction. The correct answer is B. Compare the current discharge volume to the plant's historical data and identify any trends that might indicate a problem. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a significant deviation in the energy consumption of a manufacturing facility's primary production line compared to industry benchmarks. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the auditor to move beyond simple compliance checks and delve into the operational effectiveness of environmental controls and practices. The auditor must assess whether the deviation is due to inherent process limitations, outdated technology, or a failure to implement best practices, all within the context of the relevant regulatory framework. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between acceptable variations and areas requiring corrective action, ensuring that the audit provides actionable insights for environmental performance improvement. The correct approach involves a detailed analysis of the specific industry standards and best practices applicable to the manufacturing sector in question, as defined by relevant U.S. environmental regulations and industry-specific guidance. This includes evaluating whether the facility's energy management systems, equipment maintenance schedules, and operational procedures align with established benchmarks for similar operations. This approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the root causes of inefficiency, which often have direct environmental implications, e.g., increased greenhouse gas emissions, resource depletion. By referencing established industry standards, the auditor can provide a robust, evidence-based assessment that supports recommendations for improvement, aligning with the spirit and intent of environmental regulations aimed at promoting sustainable operations. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the facility's historical energy consumption data without comparing it to current industry best practices. This fails to identify potential areas for improvement and may overlook non-compliance with evolving environmental expectations. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the deviation as a minor operational fluctuation without investigating its environmental impact. This neglects the auditor's responsibility to identify and report potential environmental risks and opportunities for improvement. A further incorrect approach is to rely on generic energy efficiency metrics that are not specific to the manufacturing sector, leading to an inaccurate assessment of the facility's performance relative to its peers. These approaches are professionally unacceptable as they fail to provide a comprehensive and relevant evaluation, potentially leading to missed opportunities for environmental stewardship and compliance. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the specific industry and its associated environmental performance benchmarks. This involves researching relevant U.S. EPA guidelines, industry association reports, and established best practice documents. The auditor should then gather detailed operational data from the facility, focusing on the factors contributing to energy consumption. A comparative analysis against the identified benchmarks should be conducted, followed by an investigation into any significant discrepancies. The final step involves formulating recommendations that are practical, cost-effective, and aligned with regulatory requirements and industry best practices, ensuring a focus on continuous environmental improvement.